So now we are going to be moving over to the Big Ten East. Thank you guys for watching. If you are looking at the graphic on YouTube, Xan and I have already covered the Big Ten West. That will be in a previous video. That video will be at the end of this video. You can go find it on our channel. And if you're listening on podcast, just keep following along here. We are going to be alternating back and forth here with these Big Ten East win totals. So I will kick it off here with the Ohio State Buckeyes sitting at an even 11 games. I am going to go over. Now, the best way to describe this Ohio State team, this is what I heard someone else say. It's the Empire Strikes Back. And that's what I think Ohio State is going to be this year. They finally did not win the Big Ten Conference. They finally lost to Michigan last year. They went 11-2, but if you look at what happened to Ohio State last year, they lost to Oregon earlier in the year. And if you really look at that Oregon loss, it looked like mostly a fluke looking back at it in hindsight. And then they lost to Michigan last year. The Wolverines finally got them in Ann Arbor, but that game was played in the snow. And I just feel like if that game was replayed on a neutral field, I think Ohio State probably would have won that game 2 out of 3 times, if I'm just going to be honest. Sorry, Michigan fans, but it was a great season for y'all. But I think Ohio State is primed, locked, and loaded to win the Big Ten again this year. They're heavy favorites. They return the 25th most production in FBS, which for a big team that has a bunch of high 4- and 5-star talent like Ohio State, that's not a good sign for the rest of college football. They had the number 1 most efficient offense last year. I don't think that's news to anybody. And of course, I can go through all their starters: CJ Stroud, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. They lose Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. However, they have Marvin Harrison Jr., Emeka Egbuka, who was a 5-star, and Julian Fleming also waiting in the wings. So I don't really expect the wide receiver room to drop off that much, to be frank. Running back Travion Henderson returns, and Mayan Williams is actually a very good backup too, in my opinion. So they're just absolutely loaded at the skill positions. I think they are the best skill positions outside of arguably Alabama in the entire country, if you look all around there. But the big thing here is the defense. The defense was the Buckeyes' Achilles heel last year. And even though it was very poor for Ohio State standards, it was still number 42 in FBS and efficiency. So it was rather average for Power 5 standards. But the big key here is that Ohio State and Ryan Day went out and hired Jim Knowles from Oklahoma State. Jim Knowles had the number 2 most efficient defense last year, and he did that with a lot less talent that a lot of these other programs have. And I think that was the best hire, the best coordinator hire of the entire offseason. I think that's undebatable to me. I think Ohio State knocked it out of the park with Jim Knowles as the defensive coordinator. And it may take a year or two for him to completely get this defense ramped up to playing at an elite level. But I think there's no question that with Knowles coming in, that they will automatically be better defensively than they were last season. You combine that with the offense, I think Ohio State's in store here to really dominate the Big Ten again. And then if you look at their schedule, their 3 toughest games are all at home. They play Notre Dame at home. They play Wisconsin at home. And they got Michigan at home. That's a huge scheduling advantage for Ohio State. And another thing, too, if you're looking at this win total, 11 games is pretty high. As of right now, they are a 2-touchdown favorite in every single one of their games, except Michigan, and Michigan, they're an 8-point favorite. So if you just look at the schedule here, 11 wins is the floor for the regular season. It's the same thing with Alabama. You either get your money back or they go undefeated and you win some money. Give me the over for Ohio State.
There's that push insurance, Shoob. That's what we call push insurance. And I'm 100% with you. I'm on the over with Ohio State. I just don't see them losing in the season. Granted, even if they do manage to lose one of these games, you still get your money back. That's that push insurance. I just don't see it happening, though. When you look at Ohio State's offense, they probably have a potential Heisman winner and a Biletnikoff winner on the same team. They have CJ Stroud, who threw for 4,400 yards last year, 44 touchdowns and 6 picks. That's insane. Incredible stat lines. The only person who's going to compete with them is Bryce Young for that Heisman. So basically, there's the potential for Ohio State to have a Heisman and Biletnikoff winner, because my money, if I had to put early money down on a Biletnikoff winner, would be Jackson Smith and Jigba, who had 95 receptions last year for 1,600 yards and 9 touchdowns. Let's not forget the Rose Bowl game where he absolutely exploded. So he is riding a high wave into this next season. He will probably be the first receiver taken in the next NFL draft. He had 15 receptions, 347 yards, and 3 touchdowns versus Utah in the Rose Bowl. That's video game numbers playing on rookie mode, Shoob. That's you playing your dynasty on absolute rookie mode and throwing to one guy the whole time. And that's just absolutely crazy. And then, yes, they lost a lot of production at the wide receiver position, but Ohio State just reloads. They bring in 5-star guys at the wide receiver position over and over and over again. Julian Fleming, Emeka Ibuka, and then you have Marvin Harrison Jr. Come on, these are all guys who are going to come in. They're not going to miss a beat, especially with a great quarterback, especially with a good offensive line like they have, especially with a great running attack. So now you can mix and match your offensive schemes. They are going to be so deadly on the offensive side of the ball. And Shoob, another thing, they have the best offense in the Big Ten. Okay, so we're talking about how the Big Ten is a defensive conference. And they averaged 45 points per game playing a Big Ten schedule, and the next highest person in the Big Ten averaged 35 points per game, and that was Michigan. Just think about that.
That's a
they
sizable
averaged
gap.
10 more points per game than the next person down on their list. And they're arguably not going to miss a step this season. It's absolutely crazy. And then when you look at the defensive side of the ball, sure, they didn't meet Ohio State standards last year, but they are still littered with NFL talent. Zach Harrison, Denzel Burke, Ronnie Hickman, Josh Proctor, and then they got an elite safety transfer from Oklahoma State along with Jim Knowles and Tanner McAllister to help lead that safety group. So they are just absolutely stacked. And I really like them to make the playoffs this year, Shoob. I think they might be in the national championship this year against either Alabama or Georgia. It's too early to say for those teams, but I really like Ohio State's chances this year. The toughest games on their schedule are going to be Notre Dame, Wisconsin, and Michigan. I mean, I think they've got Michigan on wraps. Sorry, Michigan fans, but it's just one of those rivalries where one team just happens to always have the upper hand, whether it be mentally or whatever the case may be. It just always seems to go that way, you know? Notre Dame, Wisconsin. Notre Dame may have a chance against them because it's earlier in the season. We saw with Oregon last year. You know, that Oregon game was probably a little bit of a fluke, but it was early in the season. I think that's why they were able to catch Ohio State napping a little bit. But other than that, Shoob, I can't see them losing more than a game in this regular season, if any at all. So I think the over is the safest bet that you can possibly play with Ohio State.
I agree. I think Notre Dame will probably be figuring a lot of things out with Tommy Rees, and they got a lot of new offensive weapons, new quarterbacks. So I think Ohio State, is a safe play in that first game. I like them a lot, but like we alluded to, if Jim Knowles, I wouldn't bet on this because it's just his first year at defensive coordinator. But if Jim Knowles can get this defense inside the top 20 in the country in year one, Alabama's going to have a big hurdle to climb to win the national championship. That's all I'm going to say. So now the Michigan Wolverines, the next team, if you're listening here, they are sitting at 9.5. That's their win total on Caesars as of June 21st. This is a team that made the college football playoff last year and won the Big Ten. What do you got for the Wolverines?
So I have them on the undershoe. And it's not that they're a bad team or anything like that. I do like them for probably about 9 wins is where I'm going to peg them. Probably about 9 wins comfortably, but their line is at 9.5. Now, could they get 10? Yes, but I feel more comfortable leaning towards the lower end at 9. They do actually have a decent quarterback now with Cade McNamara. I remember that was always something that's inconsistent about Michigan is getting a quarterback. I remember back to the Shia Patterson days and all the hype that would come behind all the Michigan quarterbacks, just for them never to live up to it. Milton, the story goes on and on and on. But Cade McNamara had 2,500 yards last season, 15 touchdowns, 6 INTs. These don't jump off the board by any means, but he doesn't turn the ball over. And he's a guy that can help facilitate or at least move the ball. He reminds me kind of Jake Fromm a little bit. Jake Fromm was a little more productive, but he's an offensive, he's your quarterback. He's legitimately just running your offense. He's not going to be a slinger, but he's just going to get you up and down the field and get you where you got to go. That's kind of what Cade McNamara does for Michigan. They don't have a lot of elite options at the wide receiver position, and they also lost Hassan Haskins to the NFL, which I think is a huge loss. However, they do have Blake Corum, who is an all-purpose back who had 1,000+ yards last season as well. They had 2,000-yard rushers, and he had 12 touchdowns as well. They also returned their lead wide receiver, Cornelius Johnson, who had 627 yards, 3 touchdowns last season. And but Shoob, when I look at Michigan, they also lost a ton of talent to the NFL. We look at that Michigan defense last year; they were very stout, very very stout, and I think that gave them the opportunity that they needed to succeed and accomplish what they did last year and finally winning the Big Ten and beating Ohio State. I mean, they had David Ojabo, Aiden Hutchinson, Daxton Hill. These guys all went to the NFL, and now they're looking to fill in the void there. They have talented guys on their roster, but those are significant holes that they're going to have to fill. And so for me, I think there will be a little bit of regression in their defense. I do think that they will still be a good defense, but I think there will be some regression. And then again, it's just a matter of, I like to say this a lot with these Big Ten teams. What can they do in their passing game? Can their passing attack improve? Because that is going to be basically what determines their ceiling versus their floor. How Cade McNamara can develop, how these Michigan wide receivers can develop, and they just need to develop their passing attack. Now, Shoob, I do have them on the under. I think they will lose to Ohio State. I think Penn State, Iowa, and Nebraska pose a threat to them as well. And so they could very well win 10 games, but I'm pegging them for about 9.
So I am actually going to take the over here with Michigan. I think this team can get to 10 wins, but I think the schedule is the main reason for why I have this. But before I get to that, I'm with you with the offense. It was a very good offense last year. It was actually just inside the top 5 in efficiency last year in all of college football. Very good job by offensive coordinator Josh Gaddis. But Gaddis, he went to Miami. Mario Cristobal poached him from Michigan. So Michigan will be bringing in a new offensive coordinator. Of course, they have a ton of guys returning on offense. So with a lot of the personnel back, it'll be a new OC. I still think that this Michigan offense will still be pretty good. However, and like you said, with Cade McNamara, he got the nod last year, but I'm really interested to see what happens with the quarterback position because they also have JJ McCarthy. And JJ McCarthy, I feel like he offers a little bit more upside if Michigan were to decide to go to him long term. But the key factor here is when you're looking at this win total, they got depth at quarterback. They had 2 very good quarterbacks. So if there's an injury to one of them, they have a really good quarterback who can at the very least, match the production of the other one. And I feel like that gives this team a very, very good floor, which is why I think there's a little bit more value on the over here, if I had to say. The defense, like you said, they lost a lot of guys to the NFL, those players you mentioned. The D-line obviously won't be quite as good as it was last year. I think the defense takes a step back. They only returned 3 of their starters off of last year's defense. It was pretty good, but they got a lot of guys lost to the NFL. So will they be able to replicate that? I don't know, but I'm going to bet that they probably don't. However, the schedule is very, very favorable. Their non-conference is a breeze. Colorado State, Hawaii, and UConn, those are all very bad teams. They should breeze through that. And then if you look at their home games, I think it's very favorable that they got Penn State and Michigan State at home. So that's another reason why I like this over. They got 2 of their stronger opponents in the Big Ten East. They got them at home. Of course, I'm just going to write off that Ohio State loss as an L. But if you omit that, I think they can still finish 10-1 if you omit Ohio State. And then their crossover is fairly reasonable. They got to go at Iowa, which I'm not very high on this Iowa team. I think Michigan's the better team. They beat the tar out of them last year in the Big Ten championship game. I think they can win that game. They got Nebraska at home, which even though Nebraska could be a good team, they got them at home. And then they got Illinois, which should be a win. The schedule, I think, really worked out well for Michigan this year. And again, if you really omit that at Ohio State, which I think we agree is an L, it's a team that I think can go to 10-1. They got a good floor. So that's why I have the over. But again, it's not the strongest of leans for me. And now moving down here to Penn State. Penn State had a very odd season last year. Their win total is pegged at 8.5. The Nittany Lions had a really odd season. They started out 5-0 last year, but then they finished the year 2-6. They lost a lot of close games. They had 4 one-score losses. They had a lot of bad luck go their way. So I think this Penn State team definitely was a little bit better than what their record showed last year. But their win total is up at 8.5. I still am going to go with the under here. And again, not the strongest lean, but my reasoning for this Penn State under is that the defense lost 5 starters off of the defense to the NFL draft. Defensive coordinator Brent Pry is now the new head coach at Virginia Tech. So they lost a really good defensive coordinator in Pry, who's the new head coach over in Blacksburg. So I would expect the defense to drop off a bit. They did hire Manny Diaz. Manny Diaz now is the DC at Penn State. So it's a very interesting, very splash hire there, but we shall see. I expect the defense to take a step back. Offensively, they were pretty mediocre last year with Sean Clifford, who's a fifth-year senior. I think Sean Clifford's he's a decent college quarterback, but he doesn't offer any more upside than what he's shown, in my opinion. And they lose their leading wide receiver, Jahan Dotson, who was very productive last year. However, Penn State does still have some really good, talented receivers turning. Keandre Lambert-Smith, to name just one of those few. So I still think they'll have good receivers to work with. But I think one positive for this Penn State offense is that offensive coordinator Mike Yurcich, I think, is a pretty good offensive coordinator, and he's returning for his second season. So with Clifford at the helm at quarterback and Yurcich's second season, I think Clifford might be a little bit more comfortable and might perform a little bit better than he did under his first season under the new system. I think the offense just has to be better if you're just looking at it on paper. I don't think it can be any worse than it was last year. So that'll probably counteract the defense regressing a bit, in my opinion. The thing that I want to say about this Penn State team is I think that even though I'm taking the under for this season, I think the future is very bright for them. And I really like Drew Aller, their true freshman quarterback. I think with Aller, even this season, if Aller is talented enough to be the quarterback this year, if Penn State decides to go to him at any point, that really looks good for this 2023 Penn State team. And I'm very high on this team next year in 2023. They could be a team that has the upside to win the Big Ten, but not this year. This year, I'm going to go with the under. And then very briefly, the schedule, kind of tricky. They open the season at Purdue. Then they got to go at Auburn, which against Auburn early in the season, I think is sort of a 50-50 game. They got to go at Michigan, which doesn't necessarily help their case. And then they draw Minnesota and Michigan State at home, which are certainly winnable games, but those are definitely games that they are at risk of losing. So it was tricky for me, but I'm going to lean towards the under. However, I'm very high on this future beyond this year for this Penn State squad.
This is another one where we have a little bit of a disagreement. When you're talking about Sean Clifford, it definitely seems pedestrian when you watch him. He seems like he's hit his ceiling, but I was surprised to see that he actually had surprisingly good stats last year, which really puts him as one of the better quarterbacks in the Big Ten statistically. He had 3,100 yards passing, 21 touchdowns, 8 picks, pretty solid ratio, roughly 3-1. They also have Noah Cain and Kenyon Lee split back work coming back. Noah Cain, a former 5-star. They definitely have talent at the running back position, although it's, Noah Cain hasn't really lived up to the hype, but at the same time, he's still a talented guy. A couple things I really want to mention, in addition to the wide receiver that you mentioned, is they also have Parker Washington returning, who's considered one of the best receivers in the Big Ten, who had 64 receptions, 840 yards, and 4 touchdowns last year. He was 9th in the Big Ten in receiving yards.
Yeah, I should have mentioned him.
And then we also have a huge transfer get for them at the wide receiver position in Mitchell Tinsley. They got him from Western Kentucky, and and we know about Western Kentucky last year with Bailey Zappi. He was slinging the ball. Over here, Mitchell Tinsley from Western Kentucky, let's just look at the production he offers this offense. Potentially 87 receptions, 1,400 yards, and 14 touchdowns. That is a significant boost to this team's offensive attack. So yes, they did lose Jahan Dotson, but I think they just reloaded and they're going to be in a good position to stay relevant offensively. And for that reason, and like you mentioned, Shoob, they lost a lot of close games. They started the season off really well. They also returned one of their best defensive backs in Jair Brown, who led the NCAA in interceptions. And they were third. They had the third-ranked defense last year in the Big Ten. They only gave up 17 points per game. I mean, I know they lost a lot of guys, but they do have a lot, and they're too deep to have experience. I think they may regress a little bit, but they're still probably going to produce a pretty good defense. I don't think that they're going to allow more than 21, 22 points a game on average. And I think their offense is going to at least stay the way that it is now, if not improve, based on that transfer and that Parker Washington has another year under his belt. So I do think that Sean Clifford, he's also a little bit of a dual threat. He doesn't get enough credit for that. He can move a little bit. I do think that Sean Clifford, this is a make or break year for him, obviously, because it is his last year. And if he really wants to play at that next level, I think this is the year to do it. And he showed last year that he can play a little bit under the radar, but Sean Clifford definitely is not a complete scrub. I wrote him off a little bit. I will admit that a little bit last year and the year before that. Just basically, if you brought up Sean Clifford, I was not a believer, but he sneakily put up some pretty good stats last year. And for that reason, I just believe that Penn State has the offensive firepower to go ahead and hit this over. And I really do think they're primed to finally have a nice, good season that will put them in the right direction moving forward.
Wow, so look at that. So we agree, or we disagree rather, on two of the top 10 teams in the Big Ten East. We disagree on Michigan and Penn State. How about Michigan State, the Spartans? They had a very good year last year. Their win total is sitting at 7.5. What do you got for Michigan State?
This one was really hard for me, Shoob, because I actually think they're a pretty solid team, even without losing Kenneth Walker. But their schedule is brutal, man. Their schedule is absolutely brutal. They play Western Michigan, Washington in the non-conference. They may go 1-1 in that game. Washington's not a cakewalk. They may win both those games, but let's look at their Big Ten schedule. They play Minnesota, Maryland, Ohio State, Wisconsin, Michigan, Penn State. Their schedule is absolutely brutal, Shoob. Now, I think this team is a good team. I really do. I do think they're capable of winning like more than a few games. But the thing is, their schedule is just so crazy. They're going to have to overcome so many obstacles just to hit an 8 wins. And I think it's not going to be indicative of just how quality of a team this is when they win 5 or 6 games, say. I think they're probably going to finish with 6, 7 wins. That's where I'm going to peg them. And I think they're a better team than that, but their schedule just man, it's just not fair for them. I will go on a record saying that they did lose Kenneth Walker and they lost Jalen Naylor, two big offensive pieces last year, but they do have a solid quarterback in Peyton Thorne, who had 3,200 yards last year, 27 touchdowns, 10 picks. Pretty solid. A big plus for them is that their lead receiver, Jaden Reed, is returning. He was a 1,000-yard receiver with 10 touchdowns. They also returned Trey Mosley, who was their third guy up in line behind Naylor. And then Keon Coleman, a talented transfer, who was a 4-star. So he's a pretty, they got a lot of talent on the offensive end of the ball. So when it comes to Michigan, I do think they have a lot of upside. When you look over at their defense, I got to say, like, Cal Halliday, tackling machine, 96 tackles. Their safety, Xavier Henderson, 96 tackles. They have some guys who are aggressive. They are going to have a very stout run defense. If you look at their overall linebacker group in general, they're another team that has a very strong group of linebackers who really know how to get after the ball. Their defensive line is a little bit average, but I really do think that they have a lot of talent in the linebacker position, and there's some potential in their secondary. Now, they had the number 10 rated defense last year in the Big Ten, which is not fantastic at all. But on the plus side, they didn't lose a ton of defensive production. So that can only lead to them improving this year moving forward. So I do like them as a team. I do think that they are a good all-around team. I just think they're going to hit the under because the teams that they play, it's just such a brutal schedule, Shoop.
I agree with you. I have the under for this team. I thought this would be a team that we disagree on, but I agree as well. The under 7.5 for Michigan State, and for pretty much all the same reasons. The main one, obviously, is the schedule. And like you said, they do return the 27th amount of production in all of FBS, which generally you would think that's probably means it's a good thing for Michigan State. Head coach Mel Tucker, I think he did a good job in the transfer portal. He really is plugging the holes on his roster. He brought in 6 transfers that are projected to be starters for this season. So he went ham in the portal. QB Peyton Thorne had decent numbers last year in ratios as well. The defense was 10th in the Big Ten last year. That really was Michigan State's problem, is their defense was not really that great in allowing points, but I feel like that was a little bit fluky because they were number 46 overall in FBS and efficiency. So maybe the defense was just a little bit better than what the points allowed shows. They do return 9 out of 11 starters on that defense. So it's pretty much a safe bet to say this defense will be better than it was last year. But like you said, it's the schedule, man. I mean, Western Michigan, Akron, which should be wins, at Washington. I kind of like this Washington team with the new head coach and the new regime there. They got to go at Washington too. That could be tricky. Then the crossover, they draw Minnesota and Wisconsin, two teams that we're both high on. And then, like you said, they got to go at Penn State and at Michigan. Those are the two teams those are 2 out of 3 teams looking ahead of them in the Big Ten East, and they both got to draw them on the road. It's just, it would be a really good coaching job by Mel Tucker to get the Spartan team to 8 wins, in my opinion. And again, those of you who looked at Michigan State's record last year and saw they went 11-2, and you see they return the 27th amount of returning production and their win total sitting at 7.5, you must be thinking, oh my goodness, this is an easy over. Proceed with caution. This is why we do this. This is why we get under the hood. Michigan State was pretty lucky last year. In one possession games, they went 4-0. And especially that Michigan game, we both watched that together. They were very, very lucky to win that game. And I really think that this win total is correctly pegged down to 7.5. And I actually originally had them as over because there's a lot of reasons to like the team, but it's just the schedule. Schedule is why I'm going to flip my lean here to under. And now moving on.
It's crazy, Shoob. You know, Michigan State's a very solid team all around, but man, they just got a bad draw.
Absolutely. So if you really like the over here, my warning to you is proceed with caution. So now moving down here to Maryland, I have the over, as you can see, at 6 wins here, 6.0. The whole number for Maryland is their win total. I really like this Maryland team, and this is arguably my strongest lean here of the entire Big Ten. QB Talia Tagovailoa returns along with wide receiver Raheem Jarrett. I got the first letters mixed up there. They also return Dante Davis, who was hurt for most of last year, who's a very talented receiver from injury. And then they also landed transfer Jacob Copeland from Florida, who was Florida's leading receiver last year. So this Maryland receiving core is actually pretty stacked. They got a lot of good receivers. I think Mike Locksley did a really good job there. And they also return all 5 of their offensive linemen who started last year. So the entire starting offensive line returns along with the quarterback. They have a loaded and healthy receiving room. This offense, I think, can be really good, and it's going to take a step forward. Talia Tagovailoa quietly put up solid numbers last year, and I think that there's an extra level to his game that he can unlock. This Maryland offense especially has a lot of upside, and that's the primary reason why I like this over here. The defense is the biggest Achilles heel here. It was truthfully, the defense was pretty awful last year. It was number 104th in efficiency in all of FBS, but one thing that I think a lot of people, if you want to dig in here, their last 2 games, Maryland fans will know what I'm talking about. Their last 2 games, they dominated. Granted, it was against Rutgers and Virginia Tech, but after looking pretty awful on defense all season, Mike Locksley fired the previous defensive coordinator, and he promoted his new defensive coordinator, Brian Williams, internally. And Brian Williams called the defensive plays those last 2 games, and they held both of those teams to under 2 touchdowns. And Maryland looked really good. They looked like a different team in those final 2 games of their season. And if you're looking at the win total here, it's sitting at 6 games. They won 6 games in the regular season last year. I think with Williams now, just having somebody different at defensive coordinator, even though the defense will still probably be pretty awful, if the defense just slightly improves to go from awful to maybe just poor, if you consider those 2 different tiers, this offense, I think, has the upside to be a top 15, top 20 offense. And I think this offense can carry them north of 6 wins. And if you look at the schedule, the non-conference is very winnable. They got Buffalo at home. They go at Charlotte. Certainly should be 2 wins. And they got SMU at home. SMU is obviously one of the better G5 teams, but they're a team that has a new head coach after they lost Sonny Dykes. So I think drawing SMU early and at home is probably an advantage for Maryland. And they got some very winnable home games. They got a lot of the teams that you would normally say are maybe 50-50 with Maryland. They got them all at home: Purdue, Northwestern, Rutgers, Michigan State. And then they got Indiana on the road as well, but they should probably beat Indiana if my projection on them comes true. I think this is the safest team to get to north of 6 wins. And because the line is sitting at 6 instead of 6.5, I think you got that push insurance. I think that the floor here is 6 wins for this Maryland team. Very high on them. The offense should carry them. Just because the defense will still probably be pretty awful, it doesn't mean they can't get to 7 wins or more. I really like this Maryland over.
I mean, you took the words right out of my mouth, Shoob. I really love the offense. I mean, they averaged 29.3 points per game last season. Pretty solid. They can only get better. Talia Tagovailoa has gotten better in every season that he's been over there in Maryland. He had 26 touchdowns, 11 interceptions last year, but he had 3,800 passing yards. Very good for the Big Ten, especially. They will be a little bit inexperienced at the running back position. They'll be playing some young guys, but that's not their bread and butter. Their bread and butter is slinging the ball. And like you said, they have a lot of weapons to throw to. And Talia Tagovailoa, the brother of Tua Tagovailoa, for those of you that didn't connect those dots, is he's not a bad player. He's shown that he can sling that ball. And like you said, Shub, their defense dreadful. They allowed 31 points per game last season, which was second worst in the Big Ten. But they still have a very good offense that I think is only going to get better. And not to mention the favorable schedule. They do play Charlotte. They do play Buffalo. They do play Indiana, Northwestern, Rutgers, and they play Purdue. These are all teams that are at the weaker side of the Big Ten. So they have a very good draw this year for their schedule. And not to mention that SMU game, they may not win that game, but it is a winnable matchup. So at the very least, I think they're looking at 6 to 7 wins. So like you said, I think there's very good push insurance with this pick. And I think Maryland is a rather safe option.
So we both agree on Maryland. Now, moving down here, these last two teams will pick up the pace here. Rutgers is sitting at 4 games, the whole number there. What do you got for the Rutgers Scarlet Knights?
Oh boy. I am not high on this Rutgers team, Shub. Not at all. When I look at their options at quarterback, I see quarterback Noah Vedral, who had 1,800 yards, 7 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. And their other option is Gavin Wilsmat, who had 0 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Wimsat, yeah. And basically, their option is bad and bad to this point. Now, can those guys improve? Sure, but it's looking really rough for them. They brought in a lot of transfer wide receivers, but none of them were all that prolific at their previous destinations. None of them have ever had a 500-yard season or anywhere close to that. They had the 12th rated offense in the Big Ten and the 11th rated defense in the Big Ten. Just bad. And in addition to that, they also lost their best offensive player to the NFL in Isaiah Pacheco, and that's going to hurt them a lot. They do still have a pretty solid safety in Avery Young, who led the team with 81 tackles, but ultimately he's not going to be able to do everything for them. He's like the one bright spot in this entire team when I look at them. I think they have a very tough hill to climb. I don't think Rutgers is going to, their line is 4, so they have to win 5 games to basically cover that. And I just don't think it's going to happen. I think they'll be very lucky to win 3. If they win 4, fantastic. But I just do not see them getting the over on this. I'm going to have to go with the undershoot.
I agree with you. And for a lot of the same reasons, I am under Rutgers at 4 wins. I think 4 wins probably is the ceiling for this team. Greg Schiano, I do like a lot. And I think that overall in the long term, Greg Schiano will probably be a good thing for this Rutgers program. But this season, I think that his 3rd season and his 2nd stint as the head coach, I don't think it's going to be very good. Their defensive line was actually shocking to me. Last year, Rutgers was number 5 in the entire country in defensive line yards. So like their defensive line was elite last year. I could not believe that. But they only returned one of those guys off the defensive line from last year. So that will obviously take a mega step back. But that was pretty impressive. And I was shocked to see that Rutgers was really that stout along the D line last year. Offensive coordinator Sean Gleason returns for his 2nd season. He had one of the worst offenses in FBS last year as the coordinator. He kind of brings a different element of play calling style to the game. It's very non-traditional, and we'll see if maybe the offense can maybe get settled, get more used to Gleason's system. But I just think, as you alluded to with the quarterback options, not very great right now. I actually do kind of like Gavin Wimsat, as he's got a little bit more of an upside, but he still is pretty raw. He's just a freshman. He was a 4-star player in the 2021 recruiting class. So maybe over the long term, Wimsat might actually be a good player who can also run the ball as well. He could be a very good dual threat. But Noah Vedral, 6th-year senior, he doesn't offer any upside. He is who he is. And then you look at their non-conference, they got to go at Boston College, which is probably a loss. I think Boston College would be a very solid team. Wagner will be a win. Then they got to go at Temple, which that you can't really say that's a guaranteed win in the bag.
That one's a toss up.
Right. And then after that, I think their really only other winnable game is Indiana. So I only listed 4 games there that I think Rutgers maybe has the potential to win, and their win total sitting at 4. I'm with you. You got to go under here. So now moving down here to Indiana, this line was actually a 3.5 a few days ago. It just recently moved up to 4. This Indiana team had, I'll just say, they had a very strong and hard fall from grace from the 2020 season, where this was a team in 2020 that we did a video that year of the hypothetical 12-team college football playoff, and Indiana was in the 12-team hypothetical college football playoff in 2020.
Oh, how the mighty
Obviously,
have fallen.
right. Obviously, hindsight's 2020. Indiana probably really benefited from the COVID season that year. If that season was stretched out, maybe that team is not as good as it looked, but they went 10-2 last year. Tom Allen really had a lot of problems last year. QB Michael Penix was just awful. He fell off last year. He was pretty good in 2020. I do not know what happened to him, but he just absolutely fell off. He transferred out. He's off to Washington, and they brought in a new quarterback, Connor Bazelak. Bazelak comes in from Missouri, which makes this Indiana team kind of intriguing because Bazelak, obviously, I still think he offers a little bit of upside, but the defense was one of the worst in FBS last year. However, they do return 7 starters. It should be improved a little bit. I really don't think they can get any worse than they were last year. And that just goes for the whole team. I don't see how this team can be any worse than they were last season. Running back Sean Shivers is a transfer from Auburn, who I think was actually a very good pickup in the transfer portal. I think Shivers will offer a much needed improvement in the running game because the running game last year for Indiana was awful. So I think that was a very good transfer portal land for Tom Allen. And another thing too is that Allen replaced both offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators. So again, with a team that was 2-10 last year and was just awful, making the change at coordinators on both sides of the ball, I feel like you can't get any worse than you were last year. It can only be a good thing at the very least. And then their non-conference games, they got Idaho, Western Kentucky, and then at Cincinnati. I think you'd probably be happy to win 2 out of 3 of those games. Cincinnati, especially on the road, I don't know if Indiana would be favored against them, but they might actually be able to win that one with all the Cincinnati's lost. However, they do also have some winnable games. They got Illinois at home, which I think is a good draw. That's a very winnable game at home. At Rutgers is certainly winnable. And then maybe Purdue or Maryland, if we're high on both of those teams, but they got both of them at home. So if those teams don't have the greatest seasons, I think they can win those games. I think you just look at the transfers they brought in, the new offensive coordinators, just sort of flushing the toilet on last year and sort of refreshing with a new staff, new quarterback, new running back. I think that this Indiana team can only go up from last year, and you can see the win total. The odds makers are agreeing with us. It moved up to 4 wins. I'm going to go over, but again, not very confident in this.
So for Indiana, I'm actually going to take the undershoe. They do have Connor Bazelak, who I agree, he does have a little more upside than what they've had over there in Indiana. And he did show some promise over at Missouri, but he kind of fell back to the normalcy for a little bit, and that's why he ended up getting overtaken and he had to transfer out. But he does still have potential, and I think being in a good or a new system will definitely benefit him, and he's definitely one to watch. You mentioned the transfer running backs. Definitely brought in some good transfer running backs. However, these transfer running backs are not too experienced to date in the college football setting, so it'll be interesting to see what they can do. They're a huge question mark because they don't have that experience. They also did bring in a pretty good JUCO wide receiver named Cam Camper. He had pretty good JUCO stats, but other than that, they don't have a lot of production at wide receiver. And so Connor Bazelak's going to have his work cut out for him there. In addition to all of that, they had the worst defense in the entire Big Ten last year. They gave up 33.3 points per game on average. That's absolutely terrible. And in a defensive conference, nonetheless. And they also, in addition to that, had the second worst offense in the Big Ten last year, only averaging 17 points per game. So and then let's just consider one more thing with this defensive. They had the worst defense last year, and they lost their best defensive player, their anchor man, Micah McFadden. He he was one of the top people in all of college football in tackles for loss. He had 15 tackles for loss, 15 and a half, sorry. And he also led the team in sacks. This dude was a one-man wrecking show for their defense, and without him, they are going to have a significant hole when they already had many holes to fill to begin with. So when it comes to Indiana, I think there's going to be a lot of growing pains with them. I don't know how those running backs are going to look. Their defense, I think, is not going to improve to any degree, but there could be some upside with the quarterback play. But Shoob, it really depends. You can have a good quarterback, but if he doesn't have a good system around him, if he doesn't have good people around him, it's kind of hard for a guy to succeed in a system like that. So it'll be interesting to watch Indiana, but for all those reasons, I've got them on the under, and I just don't see them winning more than 4 games.
Fair enough. So Xan and I disagree on the Hoosiers win total there at 4 games. So if you're watching on YouTube, thank you for watching here. Hopefully we provided some good analysis for you. If you want to go back and check our Big Ten West video, you can do that. You'll be able to find it in the description or at the end of this video. So thank you all for watching.